Okay, what we want to talk about today are the stages of mitosis. And before we actually get into the 4 individual stages of mitosis, we want to quickly review the idea of interphase. And if you remember interphase, when we talked about cell cycle, that is when the cell is performing all of its basic functions and activities. Remember, this takes up a majority of the cell cycle, or the majority of the cell's life. That's when, again, all your cells are doing their job. Right? Towards the end of interphase, right, the DNA is copied. Right? And that copying of the DNA allows the cell to get ready for mitosis. Right? And if you remember, we talked the other day about your DNA, and if it's represented in the form of money, and if you have $100 worth of DNA, right towards the end of interphase, the cell makes a copy of that money, and it's identically the same. And so for a brief moment, there's $200. There's double the amount of DNA in the nucleus. And if we quickly just label our diagram, here we have the whole structure inside the cell, and that is our nucleus. And we have the nuclear membrane, which is something we haven't talked about. Right, there's our DNA, and it's in a pile of loose strands. And our last structure, these are also new. These are called centrioles, and I just want to go back to that. I apologize. Right here we have our centrioles, and these little rods, right, they kind of act like magnets, and they're very important during the stages of mitosis. So now let's take a look at the 4 specific stages of mitosis. And the first stage is called prophase. All right. Now, during prophase, you obviously notice some very distinct differences within the cell if you look at the diagram. And the first thing we want to say is that the DNA condenses. And if you remember, the other day we talked about DNA condensing. That means those loose strands, the string or the yarn, begins to wrap around proteins. And they form those very solid structures, right, called chromosomes. Right? And now I've drawn a chromosome here, and just quickly, looks like our Under Armour logo, right? But on each side, right, on the left side and on the right side, you have 2 individual structures called chromatids. And these chromatids are then held together by this thing called a centromere, all right? And it's like a little button, all right? So it's holding 2 separate chromatids, or 2 separate chromosomes together, all right, into one larger chromosome. And you can see that they are present inside the cell, or inside the nucleus of the cell. Second thing you notice about the cell is that that nuclear membrane that surrounds the nucleus, all right, is beginning to disappear. Right, so there are our chromosomes, and if you notice, we have 6, all right, whole chromosomes, and we're going to come back to that number later on. Right, there's our nuclear membrane, which is dissolving, and again, there are our centrioles, and you'll also notice, again, this is moving a little too fast, but you'll also notice that those centrioles have a couple little black lines coming out of them, and those are, we're going to identify those in the next stage, but those are very important as well. All right. The actual next stage of mitosis is called metaphase, and again, you see some very distinct differences within the cell. First thing you'll notice is that all of the chromosomes, right, have lined up in the middle of the cell. Right. Second thing you notice is that those centrioles have released those black lines, and now they're very long. And those black lines are called spindle fibers. And you notice that those spindle fibers, right, have reached out and are actually connecting or touching those chromosomes. And if you can imagine, it's like a spider web. So they reach out, they grab onto those chromatids of the chromosomes, right, and they're getting ready to pull them apart. All right. Okay. Let's move on to our third stage of mitosis, which is called anaphase. And now you'll notice, all right, that those chromosomes that were all lined up in the middle, all right, have now been pulled apart. And the first thing that happened is that centromere, that dot that was holding those 2 chromatids together, it dissolved. Right? And the spindle fibers, right, are pulled apart. The spindle fibers pull the chromatids apart, and they pull them to opposite ends of the cell, all right, and those centrioles, they're kind of like magnets where they attract, all right, and pull the chromatids towards the opposite sides. All right. And the last thing you'll notice is that now we have individual separate, all right, chromosomes on each side. And again, if we go back, all right, and here they are, if we count them, all right, you'll notice that we have 6 on the right and 6 on the left, 3 blue and 3 red. All right. The last stage of mitosis is telophase. And during telophase, the cell, all right, begins to pinch. All right, so you'll see that the cell is beginning to pinch, and you can already see and tell that the cell is getting ready to actually divide and turn into 2. And you'll also notice that now we have our chromosomes, individual chromosomes, all right, in each side of the cell, and there's 6 on the right, 6 on the left, and around them, very faintly, you can begin to see that the nuclear membrane is beginning to reappear. Okay. And the last and final stage, and this is actually more of cell cycle. This is the last part where that one cell is finishing its quote-unquote life, or finishing its cycle, and that is when cytokinesis occurs. And cytokinesis is when there is an actual physical separation of the cytoplasm, right? And we end up with 2 genetically identical cells. All right? And if we look, each cell has its own individual nucleus, and within each nucleus, all right, there is its own pile, all right, of DNA. And if we go back, you can see that the DNA has now relaxed, right, and loosened up. It's no longer wrapped around those proteins, and it's back into those individual piles. And now these 2 cells will go on and perform their functions, all right, in cell cycle. So they'll go through interphase, and then eventually each of those will go through mitosis and cytokinesis again.